The chamber was still humming with the usual din of whispers and shifting papers when it happened. A sudden movement cut through the room like a lightning strike. Pam Bondi, once a figure of steely composure, rose from her seat with visible agitation. Cameras snapped to attention, bulbs flashing as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. The echo of heels against marble filled the space as Bondi turned sharply, her expression tight with frustration, her departure unmistakably deliberate. Gasps rippled across the chamber. The spectacle of a high-profile figure storming out in the middle of a hearing was more than a dramatic gesture. It was a breach of the very decorum Congress prides itself on. Observers leaned forward, straining to catch every detail, every flicker of expression on those left behind. A murmur swept across the audience, a collective recognition that something extraordinary had just unfolded. And yet, the question lingered in the minds of everyone present: what could possibly have driven a seasoned political operative to such an abrupt, public retreat? For years, Pam Bondi had been known for her confidence, her willingness to spar in front of cameras, her ability to frame herself as unshakable. To see her leave in this fashion was more than a momentary outburst. It was the unraveling of an image carefully maintained. Attention shifted almost instantly to the figure seated across the chamber, Representative Jasmine Crockett. She did not flinch, did not follow Bondi with her eyes in desperation or triumph. Instead, she remained still, papers in hand. Calm in a storm she had not only survived but appeared to have directed with precision. That composure created an unmistakable contrast, one woman fleeing the spotlight, the other commanding it with silence alone. The cameras caught the polarity as if scripted. Bondi's shoulders, squared yet visibly unsettled, disappeared beyond the chamber doors, while Crockett became the unspoken center of gravity in the room. Spectators felt the shift, and even before the first news alert appeared on phones and feeds, they knew the images would reverberate across the country within hours. But this was no ordinary walkout. It was not just a gesture of protest or fatigue. It was the collapse of a facade that Jasmine Crockett had just shattered. In Congress, not every session carries the weight of history. Some hearings slip quietly into the archives, remembered only by interns and stenographers. But this day was different. The stakes were not limited to the squabble between two recognizable names. What unfolded in that chamber reached far beyond personal rivalries. It was a struggle over the very meaning of accountability in American public life. Pam Bondi had entered the session with her trademark confidence, ready to cast herself as a guardian of order and authority. For years, she had leaned on rhetoric polished to perfection, the kind of language that reduced complex issues into catchy lines designed for television clips. But here, she was not simply facing another panel or a sympathetic media host. She was under the scrutiny of lawmakers, journalists, and millions who had grown wary of arrogance disguised as leadership. At the heart of the tension was something larger than a single clash: the future of truth in political discourse. For many watching, this was about whether leaders could continue evading hard questions with bluster, or whether documentation, facts, and integrity would finally reclaim the stage. The very credibility of congressional hearings, long criticized as theatrical displays, hung in the balance. Would this be another circus act where the loudest voice won, or a moment when substance cut through the noise? The immigrant families watching from their living rooms, the working-class viewers who had seen promises broken too many times, the students scrolling through Lev updates on their phones. All of them felt a personal stake in the showdown. For them, Jasmine Crockett was not merely a representative, she was a symbol of resilience, someone who looked into the eyes of power and refused to blink. In her calm, they recognized their own struggles, their own quiet insistence that dignity must count for something in the face of arrogance. Every word exchanged in that chamber reverberated with more weight than usual. This was about credibility. Could America still believe in hearings, in facts, in elected officials standing for something larger than partisan theater? Or would cynicism win once again, allowing arrogance to walk away unchallenged? That is why the sight of Pam Bondi's storm out carried such power. It wasn't just about one individual leaving a room. It was about the fragility of a style of politics that had thrived on intimidation. Her exit raised the question everyone was already asking: if she truly had the facts, why couldn't she stay? Why walk out if the truth was on her side? The air thickened with anticipation, because everyone sensed what came next would matter more than the spectacle already witnessed. Crockett had not yet spoken in full. The documents in her hand had not yet been revealed. The silence before her move was its own kind of suspense, stretching across the chamber like a held breath. And so, the stakes crystallized. This was no longer a matter of two public figures exchanging barbs. This was a battle for truth itself, for whether arrogance could still shout down dignity, or whether facts would finally demand recognition. The next few minutes would determine not only the mood in that room, but the headlines across America. Pam Bondi's career has always been shaped by performance. Long before the cameras captured her storming out of Congress, she had crafted a persona as the unflinching attorney, the loyalist unafraid to spar on live television, and the commentator whose words carried the sharpness of a practiced blade. To her supporters, she embodied toughness, a figure who could stand in front of the storm and deliver sound bites with unwavering certainty. To her critics, she represented something more troubling: the fusion of politics with performance, where optics were valued more than truth and appearances mattered more than accountability. Her background as Florida's Attorney General had given her a platform to project authority. She understood the choreography of confrontation, how to raise her voice at the right moment, how to narrow her gaze to appear indignant, how to pivot when a question cut too close to the bone. These were not just instincts, they were cultivated skills, honed over years of legal battles and media exposure. Bondi was never one to shrink in the spotlight. She welcomed it, relished it, and shaped it to her advantage. Yet beneath the veneer of confidence lay contradictions that had always shadowed her career. She often spoke of integrity, of law and order, of holding others accountable. But time and again, her rhetoric stood in uneasy contrast to her actions. Her critics pointed to decisions that favored political allies, to moments when loyalty seemed to outweigh justice, to episodes where the pursuit of truth was secondary to the preservation of image. Bondi could speak eloquently of fairness, but when pressed, she often leaned on bluster rather than substance. That combative style was on full display in the hearing. From the outset, she entered not with the demeanor of someone seeking dialogue, but with the posture of a performer ready for battle. Her tone was sharp, her interruptions calculated to derail rather than to clarify. She wielded her words like weapons, not tools of reason. For a moment, it seemed familiar, even predictable. Another display of confidence designed to unsettle opponents and dominate the narrative. But the chamber was not a television studio, and her opponent was not an easily rattled guest. Each dismissive smirk, each performative sigh, each cutting remark landed with less effect than she expected. Instead of commanding the room, Bondi began to appear over-rehearsed, almost desperate to control a story that was slipping away. Her reliance on the old tricks, the confident interruptions, the dismissive tone, the exaggerated indignation, clashed against the seriousness of the moment. It was arrogance performed so loudly that it exposed its own fragility. Observers couldn't help but recall the contradictions. How often had Bondi spoken of courage only to shy away when evidence pressed too close? How often had she extolled the importance of accountability, only to retreat behind rhetoric when accountability pointed toward her allies? Her style thrived on projection, but when faced with undeniable facts, projection could no longer hold. In that chamber, her arrogance became a mirror. It reflected not strength but insecurity, not confidence but the fear of being cornered by something she could not spin. And when she finally rose from her seat, her storm out was less an act of defiance than an admission of defeat. For all the years of practice, all the cultivated bravado, it was the first time many saw Bondi's confidence collapse in real time. The irony was impossible to ignore. A woman who had built her image on being unshakable was visibly shaken. A figure who prided herself on standing tall in the toughest moments chose instead to walk away. And a voice that had long demanded accountability from others could not withstand accountability turned back upon her. Her walkout was the culmination of years of contradictions converging in a single moment. The loyalist who had defended allies with fervor now fled from scrutiny. The commentator who thrived on confrontation now retreated from it. The attorney who once claimed that truth always prevailed found herself unable to stand in its presence. But arrogance has a pattern. It can dominate in the short term, sway a room, even bend the truth for a season. Yet arrogance always underestimates preparation. And Crockett was more prepared than anyone imagined. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in Congress by accident, nor by inheritance. Her path was carved through grit, persistence, and a refusal to yield when the odds were stacked against her. Before she became the figure at the center of national attention, calmly holding documents that would shake a hearing to its core, she was a young attorney who had learned that truth, though often ignored at first, eventually carves its way to the surface. Her legal career began not in glamorous boardrooms or polished political offices, but in courtrooms where she stood for those who had little else but their voice. She represented clients who couldn't afford high-powered counsel, families caught in cycles of poverty, people whose names never made headlines but whose lives deserved fairness. Each case she took on sharpened her resolve. Justice could not be a privilege, it had to be a right. And if the system resisted, then it had to be challenged. This commitment carried her into public service, where her fight extended beyond individual clients to entire communities. Crockett became known as someone who didn't just show up when the cameras were on but remained when the lights were off, pushing for equity in education, healthcare, and opportunity. She built trust not with slogans but with persistence, returning to neighborhoods week after week, answering calls at odd hours, refusing to let bureaucracy silence the people she represented. Yet her rise was never easy. She faced barriers that many in her position know all too well: the skepticism directed at women in law, the dismissiveness aimed at people of color in power, the constant questioning of whether she was qualified enough. Despite her record of service, each sneer, each attempt to intimidate her became fuel. She responded not with outrage, but with a kind of controlled fire, measured, deliberate, unyielding. That resilience shaped her presence in Congress. While others leaned on theatrics, Crockett relied on preparation. Where arrogance turned to bluster, she leaned on facts. Her poise under fire wasn't simply a personality trait. It was survival learned from years of being underestimated, dismissed, and told to wait her turn. She had heard all the ways power tried to silence truth, and she had learned to respond with precision instead of panic. It was this poise that set her apart in moments of confrontation. When others raised their voices, she lowered hers, forcing the room to lean in. When others waved their arms to distract, she remained still, commanding attention by refusing to be moved. In an environment where noise often overwhelmed substance, Crockett's discipline was her weapon. She did not need to dominate the stage. She let the truth do that for her. Her sacrifices were not invisible. Long nights of preparation took her away from family gatherings. Her relentless commitment often meant carrying the weight of her community's expectations on her shoulders. She bore the criticism of those who claimed she was too bold or too unapologetic, yet she refused to conform to palatable stereotypes. For her, leadership was not about comfort. It was about responsibility. And responsibility meant being ready for the moment when truth was tested in the harshest conditions. That moment came in the hearing where Pam Bondi sought to overwhelm with arrogance. Crockett's presence in that room was not chance. It was the culmination of years of standing firm against intimidation. Every past battle prepared her for this one. Every insult, every attempt to silence her, every late night poring over documents had built the resolve that now defined her. When the cameras turned toward her after Bondi's storm out, they captured not just a representative sitting at a desk, but the image of resilience personified. She did not need to raise her voice to command the room. She simply held her ground, a living contrast to the fleeing arrogance that had just exited. But there was something more, something the audience could not yet see. Those papers she held were not mere props, not rhetorical tools designed for theater. They were evidence, meticulously prepared, undeniable in their weight. In her hands, they were more powerful than any soundbite or speech could ever be. The irony was striking. Bondi had built her career on spectacle, while Crockett had built hers on substance. And now, substance was about to win. The documents represented not just proof, but vindication of Crockett's entire journey. Proof that preparation, discipline, and truth still mattered in the halls of power. And it was precisely this discipline and fire that set the stage for the exposure that would leave Congress stunned. The chamber had barely recovered from Bondi's initial outbursts when the verbal sparring began in earnest. She leaned forward with the intensity of someone accustomed to commanding attention, her words sharp, her interruptions constant. Each time Crockett began to respond, Bondi cut across her, attempting to fracture her sentences before they could form into arguments. The tactic was familiar: control the tempo, overwhelm with noise, deny the opponent the rhythm needed to build momentum. But Crockett, unlike so many who had faced such tactics before, did not falter. She paused when interrupted, never raising her voice to compete, never allowing frustration to dictate her tone. Instead, she maintained a steady cadence, waiting for the storm of words to subside before continuing with calm precision. The contrast grew starker with each exchange, one figure agitated, desperate to dominate, the other resolute, anchored in composure. Bondi's accusations escalated. She threw out insinuations, painting Crockett as unprepared, questioning her motives, even sneering at her credibility. The words were not crafted for truth. They were designed to sting, to provoke, to rattle. But Crockett absorbed them with the patience of someone who had weathered far worse. She sat upright, her eyes locked not on Bondi's theatrics but on the documents before her, as though she carried a secret weapon Bondi could neither see nor comprehend. The audience sensed the shift. At first, the room had been filled with the restless murmurs that accompany heated debate. But as the sparring stretched on, the murmurs grew into sharp whispers, exchanged glances, and quiet nods of recognition. People in the gallery leaned forward, sensing that Crockett's composure was not passive. It was active, deliberate, and dangerously effective. Bondi's aggression, once her strength, was beginning to reveal itself as desperation. Even the body language on the dais betrayed the tension. Some members folded their arms, shifting uncomfortably at Bondi's tone. Others fixed their eyes on Crockett, waiting to see how she would respond. The longer Crockett held her ground, the more the imbalance in the exchange became obvious. Each interruption from Bondi seemed to diminish her authority, while every measured word from Crockett built quiet anticipation. Bondi pressed harder, as if sensing the tide turning against her. She gestured with sweeping motions, her voice rising, her language teetering on the edge of hostility. Theatrics were her default defense, and she deployed them with abandon. But Crockett, refusing to be dragged into the performance, kept her voice steady, her words focused. She did not rise to the bait, did not trade insult for insult. Instead, she allowed the contrast to speak louder than any retort, arrogance unraveling against discipline. In that tension, the chamber became something more than a political forum. It was a stage, yes, but not the kind Bondi had mastered. This stage rewarded patience, punished bluster, and demanded substance. And in that arena, Crockett was winning without raising her hand or voice. The murmurs swelled once more as Crockett reached for the stack of papers before her. The gesture was subtle, but it carried weight. Eyes darted toward the documents, whispers filled the room, and even Bondi's interruptions faltered for a moment as curiosity flickered across her face. What was in those papers? Why did Crockett treat them with such deliberate care? The sparring had reached its peak, the noise threatening to consume the moment. Yet in that noise lay the setup for something far greater, something no one in the chamber could fully anticipate. Crockett's silence, her patience, her steady grip on those documents. It was the stillness before detonation. No one knew the papers in Crockett's hands contained the fuse that would ignite the explosion. The air in the chamber thickened into silence. For the first time since the hearing began, Pam Bondi's voice stopped echoing through the hall. She had thrown out interruptions, accusations, and barbed remarks with her usual bravado, but now, all eyes were no longer fixed on her. They had turned, almost magnetically, toward Jasmine Crockett. Crockett sat still for a moment, as though she could feel the weight of every gaze pressing in. She did not rush. She did not scramble to fill the silence. Instead, she adjusted the papers in her hands, her fingertips smoothing the edges with deliberate care. That single motion was enough to shift the energy. The room, which had moments before been saturated with Bondi's theatrical noise, now vibrated with anticipation. Congress. Crockett began, her tone calm, measured, and unshaken. There are times when rhetoric is useful, and there are times when only the record can speak. Her words landed like a stone dropped into water, quiet, but rippling outward with force. She held up the first page, not yet revealing its contents, and allowed the pause to stretch. Bondi shifted in her seat, her jaw tightening as though to preempt whatever was coming. But Crockett didn't look at her. She looked out into the chamber, to her colleagues, to the cameras, to the public that she knew was watching. This document, she continued, who's an opinion? It isn't commentary. It's fact. And fact does not need volume to be heard. Gasps murmured softly through the audience, and the clicking of journalists' keyboards filled the air. The moment had arrived. Crockett began to read. Line by line, she unveiled information that directly contradicted the narrative Bondi had been building. There was no embellishment in her tone, no theatrics. She let the document itself carry the weight. Each sentence was crisp, undeniable, a brick of evidence laid carefully upon the last until a wall of truth began to rise before the chamber. Bondi's confidence began to crack in real time. Her shoulders stiffened, her eyes darting toward her aides, her pen tapping nervously against the desk. She forced a smile at one line, scoffed at another, but the reactions were hollow. For the first time, her usual arsenal, smirks, interruptions, dismissive sighs, felt inadequate. The words on the page were too clear to drown out. According to the record, Crockett continued, the actions you've defended do not align with the facts. And when the facts are laid bare, the question is no longer whether you can spin them. It is whether you can face them. The chamber erupted in low murmurs. Some leaned back in disbelief, others leaned forward as if to catch every syllable. Members exchanged glances, recognizing that the tide had turned. Even those who had remained skeptical of Crockett's resolve could no longer ignore the precision with which she dismantled Bondi's position. Bondi attempted to interject, her voice cutting in with a sharp, "That's not," but Crockett's composure never broke. She paused, waited, and then continued with the same steady rhythm. As I said, the record speaks louder than interruptions. The jab was subtle but devastating. The room laughed softly, not at Crockett's wit, but at Bondi's sudden vulnerability. The woman once untouchable was now reduced to interruptions that only underscored her weakening grasp on the moment. Crockett doubled down. She flipped to the next page, then the next, each one carrying more detail, more evidence, more clarity. It was not simply an argument, it was a dismantling. Where Bondi had relied on volume and bluster, Crockett wielded patience and truth. The contrast became unbearable to watch for Bondi's allies and exhilarating for those rooting for the triumph of dignity. Every pause Crockett allowed between lines felt like a cinematic beat. The silence was no longer Bondi's to fill, it belonged to Crockett. And in that silence, the truth resonated louder than any speech could have. The audience's reactions grew louder. Gasps at particularly damning revelations, scattered applause stifled by the rules of decorum, the unmistakable sound of phones buzzing with breaking news notifications. Outside the chamber, hashtags were already beginning to trend. Inside, the momentum had shifted so entirely that it felt as though the walls themselves leaned toward Crockett's voice. Bondi tried again, fumbling for words. "This is taken out of context. This is, she stammered, but her voice betrayed her. The firmness was gone, replaced by a defensive quiver. Her hands, once confidently clasped on the desk, now fidgeted restlessly. Every gesture reeked of retreat. Crockett never raised her tone, never indulged in the theatrics Bondi demanded. She simply looked at her, then back at the chamber, and continued reading. Each sentence delivered a blow, but Crockett never smiled, never gloated. She knew the power of restrained truth, delivered without arrogance, humiliates arrogance more than any insult ever could, and so the sequence built toward its crescendo. By the time Crockett laid down the final page, the silence was deafening. No one moved. No one whispered. The chamber held its breath, recognizing that a transformation had just taken place. Bondi's face told the story of someone unraveling under the weight of truth. Her jaw clenched, her eyes flickered with frustration, her carefully composed mask slipping away in front of the cameras. She looked less like the confident attorney she once projected and more like a cornered figure, outmatched and outmaneuvered. Crockett closed with precision. "We can argue all day about spin, but the facts remain, and when the facts stand this clear, it is not me you are fighting, it is the truth itself." The chamber reacted with audible gasps, the sound swelling into a collective murmur that signaled something irreversible had occurred. Reporters leaned on the edge of their seats, scribbling furiously, knowing they had just witnessed the defining moment of the hearing. Bondi's hand shot up as though to speak again, but the words caught in her throat. The bluster that had carried her through years of appearances could not rescue her now. She looked around the chamber, scanning faces, searching for an ally, but found only solemn eyes fixed on Crockett, or worse, eyes that avoided her altogether. The silence stretched until Bondi shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her hand dropped. Her breathing grew shallow. And then it happened, that flicker of recognition in her eyes, that quiet acknowledgement that the performance had failed. The villain had been rattled. The hero had ascended. And in that moment, Pam Bondi made a choice. Fight the truth or flee from it. The instant was seared into memory. Pam Bondi pushed back her chair, the legs scraping loudly against the polished floor, and stormed out of the chamber. Her heels struck like gavel blows, echoing down the corridor as cameras swiveled in a frenzy. Reporters shouted questions that went unanswered. Flashbulbs burst against her retreating figure, capturing every tense angle of her jaw, every hurried step that betrayed her defeat. Inside, silence lingered. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room, leaving only stunned disbelief in its place. Then the whispers began, hushed, urgent, incredulous. Members leaned toward one another, trading fragments of sentences. She just walked out. Did you see her face? Crockett dismantled her. The chamber, once hostile and brimming with Bondi's interruptions, now hummed with the sound of a story rewriting itself in real time. The ripple traveled outward almost instantly. Phones lit up across the gallery, thumbs flying over screens. Clips were already being cut, captions drafted, hashtags tested. Within minutes, social media lit like dry tinder catching flame. Fabonda storms out, fake Crockett exposes truth, and Phi Walk of Shame trended nationally, each tag carrying its own wave of commentary. The memes arrived just as quickly. Bondi photoshopped sprinting away from fiery documents. Bondi edited into famous movie scenes of dramatic exits. Bondi cast as the villain whose mask had finally slipped. But it wasn't only satire. Influencers with millions of followers clipped Crockett's most devastating line, "It is not me you are fighting, it is the truth itself," and replayed it over cinematic soundtracks. Political commentators declared it the moment that defined the session. Even ordinary Americans far from Washington weighed in with pride, anger, and relief. This is what accountability looks like. One viral post read. Another declared, "For once arrogance didn't win. Truth did." Journalists scrambled to reframe their headlines. What had begun as a routine hearing was now front-page news. Networks broke into live coverage, anchors struggling to keep pace with the cascade of reactions. By the hour's end, Crockett's name was on every chyron, every feed, every trending topic. Pam Bondi's storm out was already cemented as political theater of the highest order, yet theater that carried a very real sting for her reputation. Back in the chamber, Crockett sat quietly, her papers stacked neatly, her gaze steady. She had not smirked when Bondi fled, had not indulged in triumph. That restraint only amplified her stature. Where Bondi had relied on drama, Crockett had relied on discipline. And in the juxtaposition, the public recognized a moral clarity they had been hungering for. Beyond the walls of Congress, the reactions carried deeper resonance. Immigrant communities shared Crockett's clip with captions about dignity and resilience. Activist groups drew parallels between the moment and broader struggles against intimidation and arrogance. Teachers played the video in classrooms as an example of how truth can outlast noise. Even late-night hosts prepared their monologues, weaving humor into the political drama, ensuring that the confrontation would be replayed not just in newsrooms but in living rooms across the country. Yet beneath the laughter and the memes, a quieter reflection began to emerge. Viewers asked themselves what it meant for a system when arrogance could be so easily rattled by documentation, when bluster collapsed under the weight of fact. The deeper question lingered: if one hearing could shift perception so drastically, what did it say about the fragility of the facades so many public figures relied upon? Bondi's walkout was more than a spectacle. It was a warning. It revealed how thin the armor of arrogance truly is, and how powerful it can be when someone like Crockett refuses to be intimidated. And it was this lesson, deeper than the laughter and sharper than the memes, that would resonate long after the hashtags faded. But beyond the laughter and memes, a deeper lesson began to surface. When the dust settled, and the echo of Pam Bondi's exit faded from the chamber, what remained was not chaos, but clarity. Jasmine Crockett sat steady, documents still on the desk before her, a quiet reminder that dignity never needs to shout. In her composure, viewers across the country saw something far greater than a political clash. They saw proof that service and truth, when wielded with discipline, always outweigh arrogance and noise. Crockett's message was not about scoring points. It was about redefining what victory means in public life. Arrogance often parades itself as strength, but it collapses the moment it is tested by fact. Service, on the other hand, is resilient. It endures interruptions, withstands hostility, and still finds its way to speak. And that day, service spoke with undeniable force. The values on display belonged not to one party or one chamber, but to the people. Accountability is not a partisan prize. It is a right owed to every citizen. Truth is not a weapon of the left or the right. It is the foundation on which a democracy either stands or falls. Justice is not the possession of politicians. It is the birthright of the public they claim to serve. Crockett's moment reminded the country that these principles do not belong to the loudest voice. They belong to the people who insist on them, even in the face of arrogance. For those watching from afar, the lesson reached beyond politics. Parents saw it as a teaching moment about courage. Workers recognized it as validation that persistence matters, even when bosses or systems try to silence them. Students absorbed it as a reminder that preparation beats bluster. And for immigrant families, for marginalized communities, for anyone who has ever been told their dignity doesn't belong in the room, Crockett's calm resolve was an anthem: you belong, and your truth has power. The crescendo of her example was not in the storm out, nor in the headlines, but in the enduring reminder it offered. Resilience can change the story. When arrogance underestimates preparation, when noise underestimates patience, when intimidation underestimates truth, history tilts. That tilt is not always loud, not always immediate, but it is lasting. And so the hearing left behind more than a viral clip. It left a mirror for all who watched. What does standing firm mean in your life? When the arrogant voices try to drown you out, when someone attempts to silence your dignity, what documents, what truths, do you hold in your hand? Because this story was never just about Congress. It was about the human capacity to resist being defined by arrogance and to insist on being defined by truth. And in that insistence, Crockett's stand became not only a political moment, but a reminder of resilience written into the heart of democracy itself. Pam Bondi's storm out wasn't just political theater. It was a symbolic defeat. In those few dramatic seconds, arrogance revealed its fragility. For all her bluster, Bondi could not withstand the weight of documented truth calmly delivered by Jasmine Crockett. The chamber saw it, the cameras captured it, and the nation felt it. That's the heart of this story. Arrogance collapses under truth. No matter how polished the performance, no matter how loud the interruption, facts and dignity will always find their way to stand taller. Crockett didn't need to shout, didn't need to storm. She simply held her ground, and that was enough to unravel the facade. And now, the question turns to you. What does this moment mean beyond Congress? Because the same forces at play in that hearing, arrogance, intimidation, resilience, and truth, play out in workplaces, in classrooms, in communities everywhere. Standing firm isn't reserved for elected officials. It belongs to anyone willing to face arrogance with clarity and preparation. If you believe in that, if you believe dignity should always triumph over arrogance, then this is your movement too. Subscribe, join the movement where dignity always triumphs over arrogance. Be part of a community that believes truth is stronger than noise. Send this to someone who's been underestimated. and remind them their voice matters. Sometimes all it takes is seeing dignity win to spark courage in someone else. Comment, what does standing for truth mean to you? Your reflections matter, and your story could be the one that inspires someone else to hold their ground. Because as Jasmine Crockett showed the world, arrogance will always falter. But dignity, rooted in truth, endures, and that endurance is how change begins.